Heavenly Father, we love you. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to come and to worship you and to hear from your word. And Lord, I pray that your Holy Spirit would speak to us and lead us and direct us. We give you praise and honor in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen. I didn't realize it was my turn. I thought they were going to sing some more. So today's going to be a little bit different than typically whenever I get up to teach. For one, I threw my notes out. I had some notes and I decided I don't want them today. So I'm going without notes. But it's also different because of how I'm approaching the text. We're going to kind of go through the text, and it's going to be more like a Bible study today, and just kind of showing you kind of what. I'll just let you figure it out. With Purim just being passed recently, I thought, why don't we talk about Purim in the book of Esther and the significance of that. And as I was looking at the book of Esther, what I started seeing was the gospel in the book of Esther. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today and really kind of how we can, as we look through Old Testament books, how we can see Yeshua, how we can see the gospel, how we can find those things hidden in here. What's interesting is the name Esther it's a Persian name. So her Hebrew name was Hadassah, and that means myrtle. But her Persian name, in Persian, Esther means star. But in Hebrew, it means hidden or to hide or to conceal. And so it's kind of a curious name that she had. Well, and as we talk about Purim, everybody knows Purim is associated with wearing a costume. You wear a mask, you conceal your identity. And as we look through the book of Esther, we see that Esther had concealed her identity as well. And so she didn't tell the king that she was a Jew. She took a Persian name, and she appeared to be one of the Persian women, and she became the queen of Persia. And she was hiding. She wasn't revealing who she was. And so that's why oftentimes costumes are associated with Purim. Because it's about concealing your identity and how she concealed her identity. But as we look at this, I realize that I think that God was concealing his identity through this book as well. And, it's one of those books where everybody notices, well, hey, God's name is not mentioned anywhere in this book. Not even once, it doesn't say anything about God anywhere in this book. And that's caused some people to say, well, maybe it shouldn't be in the Bible because it doesn't even mention God. And, I'm on the other side. I'm like, my opinion is it definitely belongs in the Bible, and it's in here for a reason, and we shouldn't question or challenge what God has allowed to be in his word. But I think it shows us that God works through our lives, even in times when we don't see it happening, when we don't recognize it, we don't understand it. And as you look at the context of Esther, so they are in exile. They are scattered abroad. They're not in Israel. They're not in Jerusalem. They're scattered. They're in Persia. They're in Shushan. And they're under the authority of a foreign king, a foreign emperor, foreign land, foreign laws. And this book is about redemption, but it's not to save them from exile. At the end of the book, they're still in exile. But it saved them from annihilation. And so we see that even when God is punishing his people, even when they're in exile, he is still protecting them. His hand is still there to guard them and to keep them safe and preserve them, even in the time when they're being punished. Because the reason for exile was punishment. They were kicked out of the land of Israel because they were not obedient to God. And so as part of their punishment, he exiled them. And so we have several books in the Old Testament that are about their times in exile. Daniel's another one. We look at Hezekiah and Ezra. They talk about those times as well. And there's several of the books that deal with that. And then some of the prophets prophesied about it. And some of the prophets prophesied during those times. But as we look at the book of Esther, we see that they are in exile. They're being punished by God. And God is not mentioned in this book. He's not actively talking to anybody. There's no prophets in this book. God, it doesn't say, well, God spoke to Mordecai and told Mordecai to do this. It didn't say that. And so as we're looking at this book, we see that there's this very different type of book than we see in other parts of Scripture. But it's also very clear that God's hand is at work in this. And so as we look in chapter 1, this is kind of setting the stage. It says, as it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 120 sovereign provinces from India to Ethiopia. In the days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel that was that in the 3rd year of his reign made a feast for all of his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. So he throws this huge party for 180 days, and he invites everybody in the kingdom, all the noble people in the kingdom. And he's kind of showing off. He's showing how much wealth he has, how great his kingdom is. And then it says, after the 180 days, it says, when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Now, that struck me. He had a feast for 7 days. Well, what does that make you think of? We have, God commanded 7-day feasts. We had Passover, 7-day feast. We have Tabernacle, 7-day feast. Those are it. And then you think about, well, seven days, that's creation, that's the Sabbath. And so that right there kind of tells me this is showing us something that God is involved in this somehow. Okay, it's like a hidden clue. This is somehow connected to what God is doing here. And he throws this 7-day feast. And during the 7-day feast, he invites Queen Vashti to come and to wear her crown and to show off her beauty, because he's been showing off all of his wealth and his glory, and he wants to show off his beautiful queen. And it says she was beautiful, one of the most beautiful woman in the land, and he wanted to show her off. He wanted her to come wearing her crown and just to show off her beauty and to show what a wonderful queen he has. But, so let me go ahead and just skip down just a little bit. It says, let's start at verse 9. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to the king Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Bithzah, Harbona, Bigtha, Abigatha, Zathar, and Caracas, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of the king Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Okay, so he wanted her to come, and he wanted to show her off, and she said no. And the king got mad. This is setting the stage, and we see how this sets the stage here in a minute. And so the king goes to his advisors, and he says, what should we do? And they say, well, let me just read it to you. Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. Okay, so they said, we're concerned that this is going to affect the whole kingdom, that all the women are going to see what Vashti did, and they're going to stop respecting their husbands. They're going to disobey their husbands. They're going to fight against their husbands, and it's going to cause problems in the whole kingdom. So they recognize this, and they say, okay, so here's what we need to do. You need to get rid of Vashti and find a different queen. And so they said, if it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. Okay, so he says, we need to make an example. We need to make an example of her. We remove her from being queen and find a better queen to replace her. Okay, so this sets the stage for Esther. This is why Esther is allowed to become queen. And so we see that God is already at work in this story to set the stage, to bring Esther to the position so that she can actually help redeem and deliver God's people. Okay, so then it's in chapter 2, we see what happens. They gather all the young maidens of the land, and Esther's among them. And she's one of them that's brought in, and they go through a year of training and preparation. They learn about perfumes and makeup and clothing and all kinds of stuff. And after they go through all this training, then they're brought before the king, and he picks his new wife. And so it's kind of a beauty contest, right? These women go through all these beauty treatments, and then they go stand before the king, and he picks out the one he likes the best, and she becomes the queen. Well, Esther is the one who gets picked. And so, she wasn't picked because she was a righteous person. She wasn't picked because she was, God-fearing and anything like that. She was picked because she was pretty. So it's kind of a curious thing, right? But God uses this. He uses this to work out his plan. But it says in verse 10, Esther had not revealed her people or her family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. Okay? And she was the niece of Mordecai. Her parents died, and Mordecai raised her as his own daughter. Right? And so we see that earlier in this chapter. And so it says, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So he raised her as his own. But it says she was beautiful. It doesn't say she was a godly woman. It doesn't say she was righteous. It doesn't say she sought the Lord with all her heart. It's kind of curious. But she was beautiful, it says. And as we read through the story, we don't hear of Mordecai seeking the Lord's counsel on anything. We don't hear of Esther seeking the Lord's counsel on anything. But we see God's hand through it anyway, in spite of that. In spite of their not seeking him, he still is helping them. And I think that's really cool and really interesting. Again, they're in exile. The Jewish people are being punished for their disobedience, and they're under the authority of the Persian king. And God could have said, you know what, you're on your own, guys. You brought this on yourselves. And they're not even seeking his help. And so he could have even more said, you know what, you're not even willing to seek me in this time. Why should I help you? But he doesn't say that. He doesn't do that. And we see that even in this time, he's there helping them, even when they're not asking for it, even when they're not seeking it. He's still there helping them, even when they don't deserve it. Is that not grace? Right? So we get to the end of chapter 2. Mordecai discovers a plot. And so he discovers that there are these guys who are angry at the king, and they want to kill the king. And Mordecai discovers this plot, and he reveals the plot, and they get found out, and they get arrested, and he saves the king. So this is, again, part of God's provision and providence. Because of this act, this gives Mordecai favor in the king's eyes. And this is part of this plan of redemption that God has in place. Mordecai just happened to be there to hear what these guys were planning. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think God orchestrated it so that Mordecai would be the one to hear it. Why didn't Haman hear it? Right? Mordecai heard it. Why? Because God allowed Mordecai to hear it. God put Mordecai in place so that he could hear it. So when the virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family nor her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Tersha, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on the gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Okay? This is a key element in this story. And as we read later, this is the event that really kind of sets some amazing things in motion. And so Mordecai discovers this plot, and he's the one that informs Esther. Esther informs the king, and then it's written in the journals. And then later we see the king is going to read the journals, and he remembers this. Okay? Then we get to chapter 3, and we see Haman. He is the villain in the story. He's an Agagite. He hates the Jewish people, and he's plotting against them. But the reason for that is kind of interesting as well. But as we're looking at this, we see that Haman kind of represents an Antichrist type figure. He's the devil in the story. He's the enemy. And if you compare it to some other stories, let's take the Exodus, for example. There's some similar patterns in Exodus that we see here. So in the Exodus, we have, Pharaoh, this evil king. He commands that all the Hebrew children, Hebrew male child, be killed. And they're all cast in the river. But Moses was spared. Through God's provision, Moses is spared, and he ends up being put in the king's palace. But here we see the same kind of thing. Esther put into the king's palace through God's provision. Just as Moses was put into the king's palace, Esther was put in the king's palace. And they're protected and preserved in the palace. And it gives them a place of authority and a place where they can actually do something and make a difference. I think that's curious. It's interesting. There's an interesting pattern there. Hamadathia, the Agagite, and advanced him and set him above, and set a seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, Why do you transgress the king's command? Now it happened when they spoke to him that daily that he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So Haman wasn't just mad at Mordecai. He didn't just want to harm Mordecai. He wanted to kill all the Jews. He wanted to wipe out the entire race, all of the Jewish people, their whole nation. Because he was mad at Mordecai. Because Mordecai wouldn't pay homage to him. Okay? This is, shows you Haman's pride, right? He's this prideful guy. He wants everybody to bow down to him. He wants to be seen as somebody special. And Mordecai doesn't want to do it. And this also shows us that Mordecai is a faithful Jew. Right? He doesn't want to worship in the way the pagans worship. The pagans worship their royals. They worship their kings, their princes, their royalty. They bow down to them and pay homage to them. It kind of reminds me of the story of Daniel, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're told to bow down to this idol, and they say, no, we're not going to bow to this idol. And so if you don't bow to this idol, we're going to cast you into the fire. And they say, okay, cast us into the fire. This is kind of what we're seeing here with Mordecai. They're saying, bow down to Haman, honor him, pay homage to him. And he says, no, I'm not going to do that. And what happens is the same kind of thing. It triggers the anger that says, we're going to destroy you for that. Just as Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were cast in the fire because of the king's anger, because they would not bow. Same thing with Daniel in the lion's den. And he said, for a month, you're not supposed to pray to any other god. But Daniel said, you know what? I'm not going to stop praying to my God. And so he opened his window, and he sat in the window, and he prayed so that everybody could see him praying 3 times a day. He didn't try to hide it. He wanted it to be known. I'm not willing to set aside my faith in my God, even at the sake of my life. It's the same kind of thing that's happening here with Mordecai. Mordecai says, I'm not going to bow to Haman. He's being faithful to his God, even in this exile. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, verse 8, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all the other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do all the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. So Haman says, I'm willing to pay for these people to be wiped out. That's how much he hated them. He was willing to pay for it to be done. And he talks the king into writing this decree, and they pass it out, they send it out to all the countries that the king was over, right? And it said that he had a great kingdom, chapter 1, right? He was, he reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. 127 provinces. He had a huge kingdom. And they sent out this decree to all of these different provinces and said all of the Jewish people within all the provinces under Ahasuerus' reign are going to be annihilated on the same day. In one day, we're going to wipe them all out. The entire race in a single day. And so, skip to verse 13. And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day. On the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. Okay? And I skipped a part, but it's in verse 7, it says, in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, which is they cast lots, before Haman, to determine the day and the month, until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So they were casting lots to see, when would we do this? What would be the day that we annihilate these people? So they cast lots for it. And the name Pur is the name for the lots. Well, that's where the name Purim comes from. It's plural. If you have an im ending on something, im is plural. So Pur is singular, Purim is plural. El is singular, Elohim is plural. So it's when you see the im ending on a word, that means it's a plural word. But that's where Purim gets its name. It's from the casting of lots to pick what day they would be destroyed, what day they would annihilate the entire race of Jewish people. So then we get to chapter 4. Chapter 4, Mordecai hears and he figures out the plan, but Esther doesn't know about it yet. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Okay, so now we see they're fasting, and they're mourning, and they're wailing. So this tells us they're crying out for help. They're crying out to God for help. And it doesn't say God's name, though. It doesn't say they cried out to God. It doesn't say they lift up their voices to pray. It just says they fasted and they mourned. But that is a sign of them calling out for God's help. Okay? So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and to take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was. So Hathach went to Mordecai in the city square that was in the front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain to her, and that he might command her to go into the king and to make supplication to him and to plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. So Esther didn't know about this yet. And Mordecai told her what was going on. And he said, you need to go to the king and stop this. Now Esther was afraid, and listen to her response. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and people of the king's provinces now know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out his golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called in to go into the king for these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. Okay, so this is her response. She says, I'm afraid. If I go into the king, I may get killed. Anybody who goes before the king uninvited, the law is that they're killed, unless the king lowers his scepter and gives them permission upon entering. And she said, he hadn't called me in 30 days, so he may not be happy with me right now. I don't know what his opinion of me is right now, because he hasn't even called me to be in his presence in the last month. I don't know if he's going to give me favor. So she has worry, she has concern, and she said, I don't feel safe doing this. This could cost me my life. And then Mordecai writes her back, and these words are the words that everybody, the famous words of Mordecai, right, that everybody knows. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And so these words, these powerful words that he speaks to Esther, they get her attention. And she's now willing to risk it. So listen to her response. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So there's a couple of really interesting things she says here. She says fast for 3 days and 3 nights. I think that's really interesting. When you look at 3 days and 3 nights, when you look at 3 days, that span of time, there are very interesting prophetic connections to that. And it goes all the way back into Genesis. When you see Abraham on the 3rd day is when they go up to offer Isaac, and it says on the 3rd day this happened. And he says God will provide a lamb. That's an interesting connection. You see that the sign of Jonah, Yeshua says the sign of Jonah. Well, so Jonah is a type and shadow. Jonah is 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale. The sign of Jonah is what Yeshua gives in connection to his salvation that he brings. 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. We see throughout the Scripture there's this pattern of 3. It's in Hosea. It talks about raising us up on the 3rd day. And several of the prophets have similar types of things talking about on the third day. And this resurrection, this life that happens on the third day. And so this 3-day fast is really interesting to me. And it kind of points, there's something messianic about this. It's showing us something messianic. And then her response is, she says, I know that if I go before the king, I could die. But if I perish, I perish. She says, I'm willing to risk my life in order to save the life of the Jewish people. Isn't that a type and shadow of Messiah, who laid down his life on the cross to save his people? And so we see here that Esther is a type, an antitype, a prophetic shadow picture of Messiah, and her willingness to lay down her own life in order to save her people. And then we see later Yeshua does lay down his own life to save his people. Isn't that interesting? It's the gospel right here in the book of Esther. And so she comes up with this plan. Chapter 5. Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house, while the king sat in his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance to the house. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing at the court, that she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched him, the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? And it shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom. So Esther answered, If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I prepared for him. Then the king said, Bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther said. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And at the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done. Now that's, again, an interesting phrase. He says it a couple times in here. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, I'll give it to you. Does that remind you of something else? You're looking in the New Testament. We see that this is what was said. Was it Herod? I think it was Herod. Herod said this whenever his queen's daughter came and danced, right? She came and danced, and he says, Oh, you danced so beautifully. What do you want? I'll give you anything you want, up to half my kingdom. The same kind of phrase there. Because it pleased the king, he was willing to give whatever she wanted. And, well, what did she ask for? She asked for the head of John the Baptist. It's kind of like this opposite here, right? We have this opposite event happening. We have this Queen Esther she pleases the king, and he says, What do you want? I'll give you half of my kingdom. What do you want? And interesting thing she said, though. She said, My petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and it please the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them tomorrow. So this happened twice. She goes before him, and he lowers his scepter. And he says, What do you wish? I'll give you half my kingdom. And she says, Come to the banquet I prepared for you today. So they go to the banquet. He says, Okay, now we came to your banquet. What do you wish? What do you want? Well, I'll give you half my kingdom. And she says, Come to my banquet again tomorrow. And it's like, okay, she's nervous. And she's putting him off. Like, I'm not ready to have this conversation yet. Let's try it again tomorrow. I think that's kind of what's happening here. Right? But I think it's really interesting. So Haman went out that day joyfully and glad with heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, Besides, Queen Esther has invited no one but me to come with the king to a banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So he says, man, I've got everything I wanted. All the riches, all the authority. I'm like the second in command in the kingdom. And the queen has even invited me to have a banquet just with me and the king alone. Nobody else gets this honor. And he says, and none of it matters because of Mordecai. He has such hatred towards Mordecai that he says nothing else matters except destroying Mordecai. That's how evil, how much evil is in his heart, how much hatred and murder is in his heart. He's like, I've got everything I could ever ask for, but I'm not happy because Mordecai is still alive. That tells you the kind of person this is. And so his wife, Zeresh, and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. Okay, so they've already got this thing in place, right? This law in place that, on the set date that they had determined, they're going to have all of the Jewish people wiped out in a single day. But that wasn't enough. He says, you know what? Let's just go ahead and hang Mordecai. Just get it over with. Don't let him live till that day when all the Jews are killed. Let's just go ahead and kill him now. That's how evil this is, right? And so he's like, all right, so he builds this gallows. And his plan was to go that next morning to the king and to have Mordecai hanged. But listen to God's providence. Listen how God is working behind the scenes in the story, ahead of whatever Mordecai or whatever Haman had planned. It doesn't matter what the enemy has planned. Listen to how God just works it out anyway, in spite of the plans of the enemy. So that night, the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigtha and Tersha, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this? So the king couldn't sleep that night. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think God kept him awake. And what happened? Well, because he didn't sleep, he said, okay, read me the boring books, right? Read me the chronicles of the events that have happened over the past few days. And he's like, tell me a boring story so maybe I'll get some sleep. And they tell him this, they start reading through these journals of what happened, and they get to the part where Mordecai saved his life, and he's like, hey, wait a minute. Did we ever do anything for Mordecai? The timing of this is just, you couldn't plan it better. This is obvious that God is doing something here. And so the king said, who's in the court? Who's out there right now? And they said, oh, it's Haman. Haman had just entered the court and the king's palace to suggest that the king should hang Mordecai on the gallows that he prepared for them. So the king's servant said to him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman is such a prideful man, he thinks he's talking about him. He's like, oh, the king's asking me what he wants me to do for me because I'm obviously the one the king wants to honor. And so he says, now Haman thought in his heart, who would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king is ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and this horse be delivered to the hand of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights in honor. Then parade him on horseback throughout the city square and proclaim before him, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And Haman's thinking, this is going to be me. I'm going to be the one riding the horse, right? And then the king says to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse just as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. And so Haman is just, I mean, can you imagine? He was just planning on killing Mordecai that day. He was going to have him hanged on the gallows. And now he's got to parade him around the streets on horseback and say, this is what's going to be done for the man the king delights to honor. You see the reversal that's happening here. God just takes it and flips it over. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Those who want to be great will be least. And those who are least will be exalted. Isn't that interesting? Again, this is gospel. We see these same patterns in the gospel. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback throughout the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And afterward Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. Okay, so this is almost like a prophecy. He said, you're not going to prevail, you're going to fall. I think that's interesting too, because this is kind of a prophecy from the mouths of wicked Persian people who are trying to kill God's people. It's, again, kind of like in the Gospels, where you have the high priest, right? Caiaphas, the high priest that year, he prophesied about Yeshua, and he said, it's better that one man die for all of the people. Prophesying about Yeshua dying for all the people. It's the same kind of thing with this guy he's the enemy in the story. And it's prophesying something that God had established. Speaking forth God's word. Again, kind of like Balaam as well. Remember? Balaam, this wicked prophet who's hired to curse Israel, and yet all he could do is bless Israel. And in his blessings, he's prophesying about the Messiah. God using a donkey to speak to Balaam as well. God using whatever means he needs to accomplish his purpose. So, but then we get to the next day. So we had Esther. She went before the king. He lowered his scepter. She says, come to my banquet today. They go to the banquet. He says, what do you want? She says, come to my banquet again tomorrow. Okay, so now we're at the banquet the next day. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done. So there's the same, again, up to half the kingdom. Then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed and to be killed and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. So here we see Esther now makes her petition before the king. She is interceding on behalf of her people. And what is Yeshua? He is the intercessor. He intercedes on behalf of the people to save his people. When you think about the parallels with the gospel, you have in the book of Esther, you have God's people who have been condemned to die. When you look in the New Testament, the gospel, and it says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All deserve death. The wages of sin is death. There's no one righteous, no, not one. All are under the punishment of death. Everyone, all people deserve to die. According to the law, everyone needs to die because everyone has sinned. It goes all the way back to Adam. Because of Adam's sin, he said, if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. He ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and because of that, all of mankind is under the curse of sin. And because we're all under the curse of sin, we all deserve death. And not only are we under Adam's sin, but we have all sinned in our own ways. So we all deserve death. But what does Yeshua do? He comes to intercede. He comes to stop that death from happening. It's the same thing that Esther's doing here. She's coming to intercede and to stop the death that has been determined for her people. Yeshua comes to stop the death that has been determined for all people. Esther was willing to lay down her life, but Yeshua actually laid his life down. You see the interesting parallels here between Esther and Yeshua. The interesting gospel picture we're seeing in this book. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place where the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was, and the king said, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was subsided. So again, we have this reversal happening. Haman had planned to hang Mordecai, but Haman's the one that ends up being hanged. What the enemy had intended for evil, God had intended for good. So again, we see this gospel picture being portrayed here. And like I said earlier, they're in exile. They're under punishment, and God is protecting them even through that. So we get to chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And so he gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. So he gave Esther Haman's house, right? Took it away from Haman and his family. And Mordecai came before the king, and Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off a signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. So everything that belonged to Haman now belongs to Mordecai. This kind of reminds me of Job, right? Everything was taken away from Job by the enemy, right? Satan comes in and he says, does Job worship you for nothing? Take everything from him and he'll curse you to your face. So God allows Satan to take everything from Job. But then at the end of the book, you see everything is restored back even more. 10 times what was taken was given back to him. It's kind of the same type of thing here, that everything that Haman had, all the great wealth and riches Haman had, because he did evil, that was stripped from him and given to Mordecai. Esther rose and stood before the king and said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? And King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet, no one can revoke. So now, the law that Haman had passed, the written decree that Haman had written, is now being overturned. And now it's the same thing he said to Haman. You write whatever you want and stick my ring on it and sign it in my name, and it'll bear my seal so that everybody will obey it. He says the same thing to Esther and Mordecai, to undo everything that was done by Haman. So the king's scribes were called at this time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, as it was written, according to that Mordecai had commanded the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback riding on royal horses, bred from swift steeds. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day, in all the provinces, the king Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who rode on royal horses went out, hastened and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. Okay, so everything that Haman sought to do to destroy the Jewish people has now been undone. They have been saved. They're no longer going to be annihilated. They will be retained, but they're still in exile. Their lives were spared, but God didn't get them out of exile. He didn't say, okay, now everybody pack up and head home. And you notice even in the decree, they had the opportunity. They could have said, hey, we've got the king's approval. Why don't we just write a decree that all of the Jewish people get to go back home, back to Israel, back to Judea? That didn't happen. They just said, we're just going to write that we don't get annihilated. We don't get wiped out. So they don't leave. They don't leave Persia. They don't go back to Israel. They're still there. We get to chapter 9. And those people who sought to destroy the Jews, they are the ones, according to the decree, who are destroyed. And then there's a feast that is decreed. But the Jews who were in Shushan assembled together in the 13th day, as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th, of the month. And they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to the Jews near and far, who were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days in which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from the mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and sending presents to one another, and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which had been begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews and annihilate them. And he cast Pur, that is Lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these days year after year, according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. Okay, so they decreed a holiday, much like what we see in the Torah, right? God says, Passover, you're going to be saved from Egypt. He says, take the blood of the lamb, paint it on the doorposts, and this night you're going to be, eat it with your belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, because tonight you're leaving. And that night the death angel passed over Egypt and destroyed all the Egyptians, but it spared the houses where the blood was applied. And he said, this is going to be a memorial. Every year you're going to celebrate this deliverance that God has given you, year after year. So you remember how God saved you. Well, they saw that same pattern and they said, okay, we need to do the same thing here. We need to remember this deliverance. Remember how we were saved. Our lives were spared. And so they made a memorial for it. It wasn't commanded by God. There's nowhere in here that says God commanded this feast. But it's the same pattern. They're following the same pattern that God has established. That when God does something miraculous, there's a memorial to remind us of it. And so even though God's not mentioned here, I think this is showing us that this was God's doing. God did something miraculous and saved them, and so they memorialized it. Even though his name is hidden. It's not visible in here. His activity was hidden here, and that's why it's called Esther, because it's concealed, it's hidden. I think that's really interesting. But this book shows the same kinds of pattern we see when God acts. The same kinds of things God does in other places in the Bible. When he acts, those things are taking place here. The reversal of what the enemy has purposed, God changes. The way that God orchestrates things to happen so that it follows exactly what he needs to happen so that he can provide and save. The fact that Esther became the queen. The fact that Mordecai saved the king's life. The fact that the king couldn't sleep and he read from the Chronicles. All of those things happened and were orchestrated to happen exactly at the right time so that this salvation could take place. So this deliverance could take place. And if the Jewish people had been annihilated right here, if this had not taken place, if God had not intervened, that'd be the end of the story. That'd be the end of the Bible. There would be nothing left to write. There would be no New Testament. There would be no Messiah. If the Jewish people had been annihilated, we wouldn't have a New Testament. We wouldn't have a gospel. We wouldn't have a Messiah because he had to be born King of the Jews. If the Jewish people were annihilated, where would he be born? So God acted in this event for our sake. You realize that? God saved the Jewish people through Esther so that we could have Messiah. That's pretty phenomenal to think about. Have you ever thought about it that way? That the things that God did in the Old Testament, they affect us today. He didn't just do it for them, he did it for all of us. That's how great our God is. But I just thought it was really, really cool that even in this book, the book where God's name is not mentioned. There's no prophets. There's no direct prophecies given about the Messiah. This is nothing in the book of Esther is mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. Nobody else mentions it. Nobody else quotes from it. It's just this random, obscure book. And even in this book, we see God's fingerprints. Even in this book, we see the gospel. Even in this book, we see shadows of the Messiah. And if we can see it in this book, we can see it in every book of the Bible. I think that's really cool. You know, so as you're looking through Leviticus and Numbers, Judges, Kings and Chronicles, right? You're flipping through these Old Testament books. Be looking. Look for the same kind of things. Look for the gospel. Look for evidence of Messiah. Look for things that are hinting and pointing towards Messiah. I think it'll transform the way you read the Old Testament. All right? Bow your heads. Heavenly Father, we love you. Lord Yeshua, we praise you. We thank you for your word. We thank you for the way that you hide things in your word and that you allow us to discover them. Your word says it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but it's the glory of kings to search it out. Lord, I pray that you would help us to have the hearts to search it out, to search out your word, to look for the things that you've hidden, to show us your ways, your word, your glory. Show us the Messiah throughout the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. Help us to see your salvation. Help us to see that's the point of it all. Knowing Yeshua, making him known to others. Help us to do that. Lord, I pray that everything we say and everything we do would bring glory and honor to you. Lord, I pray that we would seek you first, that we would search you out, that we would follow you, that we would hear your voice. Lord, help us to see you working in our lives in hidden ways as well. The times when we don't expect it, help us to see your hand working. Help us to honor you and give you praise for that. And Lord, as we come into a time of worship, I pray that our worship would be exalting to you. Lord, that we wouldn't be distracted by conversation. We love fellowship. We love our friends and the fellowship we have with each other. But Lord, help us not to be distracted by fellowship. Help us to be focused on you in worship. Lord, I pray that you would turn our hearts towards you, that you would stir our hearts to worship you, that you would be enthroned in our praises, that we wouldn't just be going through the motions, that we wouldn't just be singing a song, but that we would actually be worshiping you, actually praising you. It's so easy for us to just sing along with the music and not to put our heart into it, not to put our spirit into it. Help us, Lord, not to do that. Help us to actually worship you. You are so good to us. You deserve our worship. We praise you, Lord, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah.